Is there any relevance of native speaker norms? That's a question for TEFLologists. Is it better to focus on form or to focus on forms? That's a question for TEFLologists. If you use a textbook, is your classroom authentic, or should your approach be more learner-centric? From feedback to learner autonomy, we'll discuss it all on TEFLology.
Welcome back to the TEFLology Podcast, a podcast all about teaching English as a foreign language and related matters. For this episode, we bring you a recording of a presentation that the three of us recently did in September 2018 at JALT's College and University Educators SIG conference. The title of our presentation was Back to the Future of ELT, Discussing and Understanding the Field's History. In the presentation, we talked about our experiences with researching into pioneers for the podcast, what insights we gained, and the position and importance of history within the fields of applied linguistics and ELT. So, we hope you enjoy our presentation. Welcome to our presentation. I think we know over half of you here, which is good. We also have a former guest on our podcast here as well, which we're very honoured that you're here. And hopefully we have some listeners too, but we won't ask you if you listen. But, today our presentation is called Back to the Future of ELT, Discussing and Understanding the Field's History. And before we get started, there won't be any Back to the Future references. There might be one or two, maybe.
Well, we tried to find a Dr. Brown, but we couldn't.
First of all, does anyone know who this is here? Oh. There's a face in there. Does anyone know who?
Is that Ronald Mcdonald?
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay, correct. There you go.
Did you know that? Am I the only person that would know that? I was just reading his book, a book about him a couple days ago.
So, for those of you who aren't aware, Ronald Mcdonald was an American who came to Japan during the Sakoku period, infiltrated Japan. He was arrested, obviously, and he ended up teaching English to a group of samurai. And he was the first, I guess, quote-unquote, native speaker teacher in Japan. The first English teacher was Jan Koch Blomhoff, I think. But he was the first kind of native speaker teacher. The reason we've put him here is because this is kind of the first figure that we discussed in terms of history. And this is the starting point of our journey exploring history. It's also kind of the most recent point because this photograph was taken by me when I went to see his monument on Rishiri Island about 2 weeks ago. This is the starting point, and from here we'll be talking more about history in the field.
Okay, so just a little bit of background information. So I think, as some of you may know, we have our own podcast called the TEFLology Podcast, and it started here at Rikkyo University in 2014. So what's that, 4 years ago? And just over 4 years ago. And we do fortnightly episodes. They're free to download. And the idea of the podcast, well, we talk about lots of different topics. We talk about TEFL news, cultures, and pioneers, which we're going to be focusing on today. So the podcast originally started out as a way for us to record our conversations together. And we often went to the pub. We still do. Not as frequent, but we still do. And we always found ourselves talking about TEFL-related things. So we thought this would be a great idea, let's record this. And it was originally just for our own benefit. We didn't think anybody would listen in, but it turns out that people do like to listen to us talk. So we've kind of developed this idea that it's an emerging form of continuing professional development. And we've tried to kind of conceptualize this a bit more in our book here. It's openly accessible. A lot of materials in our field are not. They're kind of behind paywalls. So we feel that our podcast is a way to connect with scholars in a very dialogic and conversational manner. And in the same way, we're connecting with new knowledges as well. We see ourselves as critical co-presenters, and we've borrowed that term from Thomas Farrell and adapted it slightly, in the sense that we kind of hold each other responsible. We question each other, and we're all responsible for bringing mini research projects to the table and questioning each other about what we found out. And one of the things that we've been researching recently or over time is historical figures in ELT and applied linguistics. And this has kind of snowballed, and we've realised that there's a lot more kind of wider interest in these figures, and it's helped us to connect with researchers in the UK, which we'll talk about later.
Yeah, so history is maybe not the first thing that comes to most people's minds when they think about language teaching. It's probably one of the more minor areas of research, but there are a few overviews. I think this is the first one. This is 25 Centuries of Language Teaching by L.G. Kelly. Obviously that's quite a long span, and this covers going all the way back to the Romans and the Egyptians and so on. Then you have Renzo Titone's Teaching Foreign Languages, a historical sketch. And more recently, probably the most famous overview book is A.P.R. Howart's book, A History of English Language Teaching, which gives a very thorough overview of history in the field. And then some more recent kind of sketches. Wheeler's Language Teaching Through the Ages contains short entries on different, I guess, what we would call pioneers and different groups. And DeBott's A History of Applied Linguistics is more a kind of survey overview of the most influential papers and the most influential figures in the field since the 1980s. It's less of a traditional history, this one. So these are kind of the historical overviews that are available to people who are interested in history, and there are also local or specific works as well. So, for example, the English language in Sudan here, this is a book from, I think, the 1980s, A Critical History of ESOL in the UK. This is a biography of Tsuda Umeko, who was a pioneer of women's education in Japan, particularly focusing on teaching English. Claude Marcel, a neglected applied linguist. That's a paper from Language and History. 2 books about Harold Palmer. Johann Storm is the physical copy of that one. That's my prop for the talk. And this is a paper about the discourse community in Scandinavia. We're going to be focusing on discourse communities a little bit later on. Storm was a member, or perhaps the key member of this discourse community. So we have general overviews, and we have more focused local perspectives on ELT history, but it's still perhaps not as well explored as we might like to think. So, first of all, ELT history, it's not very sexy, right? People don't think about this as being, a really cutting edge. I guess it's not cutting edge, but they don't think about this as an area that people are very interested in, generally. And there are a paucity of historical studies, as Stern noted in 1983. In the article that I pointed to earlier, the article about Claude Marcel, Richard Smith notes that that this is a neglected area of research, applied linguistic historiography. So it's not been very well studied, but it has been picking up steam a little bit over the last few years. So for language teachers, again, maybe there are a few reasons why history is not considered so exciting. First of all, it's not really mentioned in training courses. You've all done training courses. Did you do any courses on the history of language teaching or applied linguistics? No. Everyone's shaking their heads. So maybe your idea, your perception of the history is kind of this procession of methods, right? We had grammar translation, and then we had audiolingualism, and then we moved into CLT. It's like a very common understanding of history. And this is perhaps a mythologized understanding, right? This is a narrative that's been created. It's very easy to grasp onto that there's this kind of logical, scientific progression of methods. And one thing we found, which we'll talk about later, is that this perhaps isn't really the case. There's more of an ebb and flow in history. So for most teachers, there's just a lack of access. The field tends to be progressivist, it tends to be looking forwards, it tends to be trying to find the next big thing without reflecting and looking back very much, and I think that's something we'd like to promote.
And I guess something to say is, of course, there's not a lot of mentions on ELT training courses, because I guess this isn't immediately kind of useful and applicable in the moment. So of course, obviously teachers want practical things, but we think that it does have a place somewhere on a course, perhaps.
Okay, so kind of coming back to how our initial interest in this came about through the podcast. As was mentioned, one of the 3 segments we have in all of our regular episodes is what we call TEFL Pioneers. It's a way of us looking at the history of TEFL through sort of key figures throughout history. We'll show you who some of those key figures were in a bit. But just basically, since we started in 2014, we've discussed 81 different pioneers. Most of those are individuals. Some of them are collectives. Some of them are institutions. We define it as a person or a group who have contributed theoretically or socially to the development and understanding of language learning and teaching. Sometimes we perhaps stretch the definition a little bit. Sometimes there are people who are much more on the linguistic side of things. Sometimes they're much more on the teaching side of things, theoretical or social, etc. For the purposes of this talk, we have talked about people who have done some of their work since 1980, but for the purposes of this talk, we've used DeBott's 2015 sort of definition as cutting history off at basically 1980. For today's talk, we're going to focus on 46 pioneers in particular.
So we've divided them, as Matt said, into theoretical and social pioneers. And what we mean by that is that the theoretical pioneers tend to be people who help to develop the field in some way in terms of the theory, right? The theory of language teaching or the theory of language even. Whereas a social pioneer perhaps had more of an influence on the political situation of a country or on bringing language teaching to a new group or a new context or something like that. Dionysius Thrax is a very ancient pioneer. He came up with the word classifications that we use today, such as, well, actually Plato kind of came up with them, but he made it more workable, like adjective, verb, noun, and so on. This was the work of Dionysius Thrax, so he would be a theoretical pioneer. And then, of course, Ronald Mcdonald, who we mentioned earlier, would be more of a social pioneer.
So we also have Umeko Suda, who again was a Japanese educational pioneer, especially with regards to women's education. And there was also Michael West, who developed the general surface word list as well. And I think Charlie Brown is revisiting that now, so perhaps he'll be a pioneer in 40 years' time, perhaps, we'll see. And then again, we have the social and the theoretical. So the social here, Stephen Pitt-Corter was a British Council teacher trainer who went over to, I think Nigeria was one of the places he went to. And also we have, you can just see at the bottom here, Robert Gardner, who is well known for his work in language learning attitude and motivation. And I think he developed one of the first batteries. They were called attitude battery, I think that's correct at the time.
So we have some different insights that we'd like to present, so things that we've taken from this project, and we're going to address one of these each. So I'd like to start by talking about lost ideas. One thing that we found from doing this kind of historical research was that there are ideas which came up in the past, which may be in some ways similar to modern ideas, but for whatever reason have been unrecognised by the field. So this is a book that I found in my university department, buried in the bottom of like an old locked filing cabinet. And this is by L.A. Hill, who is not famous. He's not featured in any of the historical overviews that we looked at earlier. But when I read this book, there were actually a lot of really interesting articles. The one that particularly jumped out at me was an article titled Neutral English from 1956. And in this article, Hill says that they should, or language teaching, should try to move away from teaching British or American cultural norms along with their language teaching, because he said this is in danger of being a form of linguistic imperialism, and he argued that they should develop a neutral form of English for international communication. And here is a quote from the paper: "We should lend a sympathetic ear to the desires and aspirations of the many others who see in English the answer to their need for an international lingua franca, provided it is taught in a truly international way and not tied to any particular regional literature, institutions, or way of life." And he also talks in this paper about breaking English down to its bare scientific essentials so that you can teach a form of English which can then be elaborated on locally in terms of pronunciation, grammar, and so on. So I guess people have noticed, this is very similar to the modern idea of English as a lingua franca. But L.A. Hill and neutral English is not mentioned anywhere in English as a lingua franca literature. I've done quite an extensive search on this for a paper I'm writing about it, and in none of the English as a lingua franca literature, in fact almost in no literature at all, is Hill quoted in this way.
Another sort of insight we had, which is maybe connected to this idea of lost ideas, but it's the idea of a precedent for current practice, taking a very, very simple or widely known example of communicative language teaching, CLT. I chose this definition from Wikipedia, which maybe, there's many definitions of CLT and many ways to classify it, but I chose the Wikipedia one basically because I think it's a very kind of generally accepted way of thinking of CLT. And this is from the very first sentence, describing it as an approach to language teaching that emphasizes interaction as both the means and the ultimate goal of study, which I think is again, CLT can be broken down in a lot of different ways, but I think this is sort of the umbrella definition that we all agree on. However, this is a book which I found in a cabinet in the back of actually this is in a public high school in Nagoya that I worked at, and they kindly gifted it to me when I left. This is Henry Sweet. This was originally published in 1899. This is the 64 reprint. He talks about a lot of aspects of language teaching, but his chapter on conversation begins with this paragraph. I'll read it out. He says, conversation in a foreign language may be regarded from two very different viewpoints, as an end in itself and as a means of learning the language and testing the pupil's knowledge of it. But there is, of course, no reason why the second process should not be regarded as being at the same time a preparation for the first, which is basically another way of saying interaction is both the means and the ultimate goal of study. So this is 1899, a long time before the theoretical ideas of CLT kind of came out in the 60s, popularized in the 70s and 80s, and then sort of what we have now, which is, I think, how most people frame CLT in terms of their historical understanding of it.
No dusty old cabinets with my bit, but I think what discussing these pioneers has kind of led me, especially, or maybe the others, to find out is there's associations and commonalities over time. Some being very physical associations, and others transcending time and space. Is that a Back to the Future? Okay, anyway. So we kind of thought about the idea of this, and we found a good term that kind of fits this idea of being a discourse community. So in Watts's terms, a discourse community can be defined as a set of individuals who can be interpreted as constituting a community on the basis of the ways in which their oral and written discourse practices reveal common interests, goals, and beliefs. The members of the community may or may not be conscious of sharing those discourse practices. Okay, so for me, discussing these pioneers has kind of revealed these connections and relationships which I wasn't aware of at the time. And I think it's very easy when we're writing or studying in MA or writing papers, it's very easy to take a quote out of context. Let's say, he said that in that year, or she said that in the 1950s. I'm just going to grab that and put that there. So I kind of wanted to find out more about the connections that there might be in the context in which they worked at the time. Some people are probably already familiar with some of these associations, but we kind of identified three. So one example being a very physical local association with regards to A.S. Hornby, Harold Palmer. And we also look at how that's moved into the future, into the present day as well, with the likes of Richard Smith in the UK. There are also discourse communities, so we talk about this idea of the natural approach, and these scholars have had a hand in developing that over time again. Gouin, I forgot his first name. Francois Gouin. Henry Berlitz? Charles Berlitz.
No, Maximilian Delphinius Berlitz.
Okay.
there are a few Berlitzes.
There's a whole Berlitz dynasty, yeah. And Stephen Krashen as well, so bringing it up to date, although he's not that up to date anymore, is he really? But anyway, that's a whole other thing. And temporal communities as well, so thinking about pronunciation. Again, this is also over time. So we had Jesperson way back in the early 1900s, I believe. Moving forward to Daniel Jones, and now very up to date with the work of Adrian Underhill and his ideas of pronunciation teaching.
So finally, what we've learned so far, this is just to kind of recap, but basically few ideas are really new. pretty much any sort of theory or thing that we talk about now, even things that are considered very modern like ELF and linguistic imperialism, have been thought about before. We didn't have a chance to go into all of our pioneers, but we've talked about pioneers from, many, many centuries. And it's amazing how many times the same sort of things come up. We think that language teaching, the debt to history, is hopefully obvious through what we've talked about today, but maybe underappreciated, which is something that we'd like to highlight. As has been mentioned, these commonalities that we found across both time and space. And finally, this idea, we've focused maybe a little bit in this talk about ideas and pioneers from the local context, in other words, Japan, but that's just one example of how a lot of these ideas do not all emanate, as is often thought of, from the West in the 1970s.
So why is history important for language teachers? That's perhaps the main question that people will be asking themselves. So I think there are a few different reasons why people might be interested in studying the history of language teaching. First of all, this idea of reinventing the wheel, right? Developing the same ideas over and over again. If you understand the history of language teaching, then you can reduce this a little bit because you know what ideas have been tried. This might also inspire new experimentation. I know that some things that have come up on the podcast from a very long time ago, I've then experimented with in the classroom and found were actually quite useful. Secondly, understanding the social histories of the context in which we teach. So for me specifically, reading about Tsuda Umeko was really useful because I teach in a women's university, and I didn't really understand that context, and understanding the historical reasons why there are women's universities. We don't have those in the UK. And that was very important for me. So I think understanding the social histories is important for teachers, especially teachers who are perhaps more mobile, travelling around the world. And finally, it's important to understand the theoretical, political and social history of the field in order to understand where our ideas come from and where we stand as language teaching professionals.
So I guess if you have any questions or comments.
Oh, well, I just think it's really interesting, and I think it's a really, really great idea what you guys are researching and trying to connect, the historical backgrounds to the present. And I really think that looking at the history of language teaching or language education in the social context is really interesting. And when I was writing my book, I started looking into that myself, and I'm not an expert by any means on history, but you start reading it and you think, well, damn, this is good. This is so interesting, and you just don't realize all these connections that are there. So I think what you guys are doing is fabulous.
And I guess we want to emphasise the kind of the informalness of it as well. And we're not deeply looking into. So I mean, maybe Rob is writing an article about one particular pioneer, but we're trying to kind of do this in an informal manner as well. And I think that's one of the key points: is we don't want this history to be locked away in dark places.
You're not writing a book.
Yeah.
Not a book. Yeah.
Not yet.
Not yet.
I want to talk to you. Yes.
But we want to make this an informal kind of venture, I guess. Yeah.
And I guess one final thing that I think a lot of people probably get put off by reading things from a long time ago because of accessibility and, in terms of how things are written rather than whether you can access them online and things like that. But I guess both of those are issues. But I think on the podcast you've mentioned that some things are surprisingly readable. Is that what you found generally with things that you've...
Maybe not generally. Some things are pretty difficult to read.
Some things are in Latin.
Some things are in other languages. But not all of it. Sometimes, there are things that are surprisingly readable. And even the things that are, maybe the style is a little off-putting at first. You read a few chapters and you kind of get accustomed to that. Maybe we'll finish there. So thank you very much.
Thanks a lot. Thanks for coming. Thank you. Thank you very much for listening today. We'd also like to say thank you to those of you who are able to join us for the presentation. So if you'd like to get in contact with us, please send us an email at TEFLology@gmail.com, tweet and follow us on Twitter @TEFLology, like our Facebook page, and visit our website, TEFLology-podcast.com, to find all of our previous episodes and more information. If you like what you hear, please subscribe and rate us on iTunes. and please share our podcast with your colleagues and friends. Finally, we're delighted to announce that our book, Podcasting and Professional Development, A Guide for English Language Teachers, is now available in paperback. Head to Amazon to order a copy and support the show. In our next episode, we'll be bringing you an interview with Professor Christina Kono on emotions in language teaching and learning. So thanks again, and we'll see you soon.